Jumping to episode 15, a few days have passed. The crew, while at lunch, remark how Juniper has started to really show improvement quite quickly, though they note that Carden has been more aggressive lately in how he treats people around him. Even his team looks bedraggled. It should be noted here that Weiss has been eating at a different table, alone, ever since their last cafeteria encounter, and is a minor point of conversation. Regardless, this whole dialogue is punctuated with Carden bullying Velvet, this time far rougher and more viciously than before. Blake, finally reaching a breaking point, begs John to use his leverage to help Velvet. John regretfully replies that he can't, that his and Cardinal's mutual failure policy is too fragile to exploit, especially so soon after it was developed. Velvet isn't technically one of John's friends, and if he were to start including people as his friends with abandon, Carden would almost likely snap and get them both thrown out. Blake is infuriated by this and decides to stand up to Carden herself, getting Velvet out of his hands and back to the safety of their friends group. Blake and Carden get into a screaming match, with Blake calling him out on his emasculation in light of the Ursa. Carden shoots back that if he's so weak, what right does a furball like Velvet, who doesn't even fight back, have to even be in a school like Beacon? Blake shoots back with more of a right than you, and this little back and forth continues until Weiss steps in, defending Carden's argument. While she makes it quite clear that his behavior is boorish, the fact that Velvet didn't stand up to him was a clear indication of the natural subservience Faunus had in relation to humans, a belief she remarks is quite well known in Atlas. It's simply childish, misguided thought that anyone would put Faunus on the same footing with typical humans, which is why activists like the White Fang quickly devolved into tantrum-throwing babies that needed to use violence to get things done. Blake at this point is stunned speechless by the arrogant and pointedly racist comments. Yang stands up beside Blake and calls White out on her comments, to which Weiss rebuffs Yang as a simpleton for not understanding such nuanced positions. RWBY at this point speeds out the door, and Pyrrha joins in the argument, commenting that Weiss's position isn't nuanced, it's overly simplistic, and it's these words from someone we know that Weiss has respect for that snaps a few things free in Weiss's head and gives her pause. However, Carden decides to pick things up for her and argues back that Weiss knows what she's talking about, especially since she's arguably one of the most intelligent people in their class, and threatens to attack Pyrrha if she insults either one of them again. John steps in and finally pulls rank on Carden, which causes Carden to threaten him back that he can't protect his friends forever, which, you know, is foreshadowing. This is where Coco bursts into the cafeteria, the rest of Team Coffee behind her, saying that John won't have to protect them so long as Team Coffee is around. RWBY walks around the group, out of breath, having run off to fetch them the minute things started really getting heated. Carden, being prompted to stand down by the Craven Russell, finally acknowledges that he's outmatched, tells everyone to go screw themselves, and storms off, not to be seen for the rest of the season. Things are still tense though, what with Weiss's true opinions of the Faunus being outed, and her and Blake quickly launch into another heated argument over the topic. We can even have that similar jump cut like in the original rendition of this fight. This, of course, leads to Weiss talking about the family she's lost to the White Fang, and the pain caused to her that she has ended up attributing to all Faunus kind. She mentions the White Fang, Blake shouts that we were just sick of being pushed around, and before anyone has time to really digest what Blake yelled, she sprints from the room. Everyone watches her go, but all of them are too shocked to follow. The episode ends with Blake at the edge of Beacon's terrace, taking off her bow and looking behind her at the school's spires before running off into the distance. Episode 16 picks up shortly thereafter with the three remaining members of RWBY arguing about Blake, with Yang and RWBY immediately wanting to go after her and Weiss demanding they report her to the school for being a terrorist. They all try to challenge one another's points. If Blake were still White Fang, wouldn't she have struck Weiss by now? Wouldn't she have avoided blowing her cover? Weiss counters by saying that perhaps it was a long con to get closer to her family, invoking an uncle that was killed in a very familiar fashion by his wife's favorite servant. Yang retorts by arguing that they shouldn't even have servants, and Weiss shouts back that their servants are all paid a healthy wage, way more than they should considering her family's history with the Faunus. Meanwhile, Blake is wandering the town and stumbles into Penny, who seems to be assisting with more cleaning efforts to prepare for the first stage of the Vital Festival. Blake finds it weird, but Penny mentions that she enjoyed it so much that she decided to take it up as a part-time job, especially since her father wanted her to get out and socialize more, though she questions if she's properly interpreting what her father meant. Regardless, she asks if RWBY and Yang are also around, as she always has a good time when Team RWBY is together, and Blake just shakes her head no and excuses herself. Penny happily waves her off and tells her not to be a stranger, though when Blake is out of earshot, Penny realizes that no one actually knows where she lives. Blake arrives at a bookstore, and when she goes inside, we meet Tucson and learn that the two know each other from their shared history with the White Fang. He's surprised to see her, and even alarmed that she apparently quit Beacon, but he nonetheless offers his guest room to her, which she's grateful to take. Back at the RWBY dorm room, Yang has had enough of Weiss's BS and has decided to set out and search for Blake. RWBY agrees to join her in a bit, but that Yang should go and get a head start. RWBY stays behind and pleads Weiss to hear Blake's side of the story. Weiss disregards her and says that she's taking the issue straight to Ozpin. The last statement she makes is that by the end of tomorrow, Team RWBY would be completely dismantled. In episode 17, Blake is arranging books to assist Tucson as one of his sales associates, a small way for her to repay his kindness. While working, though, she overhears a few of the Faunus customers saying someone is offering illicit work for something big and that the White Fang is going to take the fall. Blake is of course alarmed by this, but ultimately turns away. Cut to Weiss, who works her way up to Ozpin's office and confronts him about Blake, her assumed history at the White Fang, and RWBY's incompetence as a leader. Ozpin being Ozpin, though, flips the conversation on her, pointing out how he's been following Team RWBY's exploits and drama rather closely considering how much of an issue their team has been for poor Glinda. He explained that what he saw during initiation more than impressed him, and that RWBY showed talent under her more childish assets, and that despite still carrying much of that childishness with her, she is rapidly shedding it to become a healthy leader. Or at least she would be, were it not for a certain Eris causing friction within the realms of her team. In addition, he's observed how amicable Blake has been if she's indeed a former White Fang member, and how he has personally looked into every student before they attend. If he finds something disagreeable with the protection of humanity, he would never permit it to enter beyond the front door, inquiring if Weiss still thinks he made a mistake. She of course says no, but he still gives her a stern suggestion to meditate on what it means to be part of a team, especially when she isn't the one in command of it. Otherwise, the only mistake he made would be admitting her to the academy in the first place. Effectively, this talk functions like the port talk, but with an extra layer of ice water to the face for Weiss, as now her haughty behavior has consequences that go beyond alienating her peers group. Or at the very least, she perceives it that way, since Ozpin never directly threatens to kick her out. Meanwhile, RWBY is downtown looking for Blake. We see that she and Yang are coordinating by scroll, but neither are having much luck, even though they've been searching for about a day. She then gets a message from Coco stating she knows RWBY's in the city and asks her to come have a drink. The question is more of a demand, and RWBY reluctantly agrees. Coco is sitting at a cafe but offers to walk with RWBY so we can avoid any actual cafe scenes. Lord knows I've already peppered the whole of this reconstruction with enough of those. Coco opens up by reflecting on her history with Fox. Her previous partner died during initiation, and Fox's partner was too injured to continue a career in hunting, so the two were stuck together at the end of things and put on Team Coffee. Coco started out as a showboat and Fox was a loose cannon, and they were constantly trying to one-up each other, eventually ending with Velvet and Yatsuhashi sitting them down and forcing them to actually work together. It still didn't work, but going through enough turbulent fights together helped them forge an understanding. It took time, but by the end of the year, Coffee was starting to gain ground where other teams were failing. Her point, she says, is that it takes time for a team to acclimate, and even with the improvements RWBY is making as a leader, sometimes it's not her fault things aren't going as planned. All she can do is try to roll with the blows until things come together. Of course, she adds, this doesn't mean RWBY can slack off and blame everything on everyone else. She should always strive to improve herself. RWBY says that doesn't really help her find Blake, to which Coco replies that she's not worried about Blake. From what Velvet says, Blake has a good head on her shoulders, it's just not quite properly aligned yet, and when it is, she'll come back to the home RWBY and Yang have helped build for her. RWBY then points out that none of that really applies to her situation. Coco admits she knows it doesn't really apply, but that she's obligated to at least attempt giving RWBY advice because she blew last year's dance budget on clothes for her and her team. RWBY just says, "Oh, okay," and the scene peters out awkwardly. The last scene is of Blake in the bookstore closing up for the night and letting her ears out of her bow, when an unseen figure walks up behind her. She says they're closed, and the stranger says, "I knew you would look better without the bow," prompting Blake to spin around in surprise. Yang is standing there looking exhausted but smiling. Episode 18 begins with Yang sending a message off to RWBY, telling Blake that all she did was make sure RWBY knew they were both safe. She didn't tell RWBY where they were or anything beyond that. Blake thanks her for being discreet, and Yang shrugs it off, casually replying it's the right thing to do. Analyzing what Yang said at the end of the prior episode, Blake asks if Yang knew about her ears and how. Yang answers frankly that she had her suspicions and noticed a number of things about Blake since they've been paired up that tipped her off, but figured that Blake would tell them all the truth whenever she felt the most comfortable, once again showing that Yang is a rather observant and considerate kind of person. Yang finally gets to the heart of the matter, asking Blake about her past, though definitely leaving an exit for Blake to take any time she felt uncomfortable. Blake gives the same speech she gave Sun at the end of Volume 1 to Yang, who is not a faunus and hasn't been able to see the politics of the White Fang from a faunus point of view, so the exposition here works far smoother than it did previously. Not to mention, it's noted here that Blake got involved young and had a normal life that she could have lived, but abandoned it in pursuit of equal rights. She goes on to explain that after their first leader stepped down, someone she seemed to hold in very high regard, the new leader became more aggressive in his tactics, and even turned a blind eye to crimes being perpetrated by lower-level protesters. And she even heard rumors of him condoning the actions as well. She left the White Fang because of this corruption, but also because she saw what it did to someone she used to consider a dearly close friend, a relationship with possible romantic implications that turned incredibly sour at the end. After she left, she enlisted Tuxin's help, a sympathizer with the White Fang, though an objector to their actions. He shares Blake's disgust for the criminal elements of the White Fang and understood it was probably healthier if he helped those wishing to leave the organization than stay with it himself. Yang is quiet through all of this, carefully listening and absorbing what she's being told. At the end of Blake's little soliloquy, Yang asks the obvious question. Why didn't she tell the team or even just Yang? Blake responds that she already got burned by someone she trusted once and wasn't looking for any deep relations at Beacon. She'd spent so much time outside the kingdoms that it was rare for her to come across hunters that traveled in groups, with lone wolf hunters having more frequent encounter rate, so her natural assumption was that most hunters operated alone. It was only during initiation that she really began to realize that she'd have to be stuck with someone for the next 4 years, and she was caught between her injured heart wanting to connect with someone and her sense of logic telling her that she needed to remain detached, thus explaining her almost bipolar investment in the team. Yang just smiles though, and says that when you're friends with her, you're friends for life, even if you never see each other again. It's not the distance that matters, it's the connection, which is a sentence that triggers some form of melancholy for herself. We jump over to the RWBY, who's just receiving Yang's message and is heading back to her dorm. Before she can get into the dorm, however, she overhears Weiss approaching Pyrrha to talk about something. We cut closer to Weiss's perspective and see that Pyrrha isn't too happy with the way Weiss handled herself in the argument the other day, especially with her racist mindset barred to the world. Weiss, however, pleads a listening ear, and Pyrrha relents since she's too inclined to be nice even when she thinks someone is wrong. The two go up to the roof and RWBY follows along, eavesdropping. Weiss admits that she's more than confused about everything happening around her and her team. Back in Atlas, everyone would kowtow to her will, the only people that wouldn't were her own family, and she left specifically to break free of them. But now she's finding it harder and harder to connect with anyone, and with even the headmaster of Beacon glaring over his glasses at her, she feels sick to her stomach with anxiety. She came to Beacon to be free, but feels more suffocated than ever, and Pyrrha's the only person she knows who might be able to understand since the Mistrillian is her own form of celebrity royalty. Pyrrha pulls pieces from what Weiss is saying in order to help Weiss sort through it, and even manages to relate with some of that grief. There was a point where she only saw the people around her as there for her, as servants, but after an accident that Pyrrha was responsible for, some sense got knocked into her head that these were still people around her. She tried to take responsibility for the accident, but the PR team covered it up, even if she and the family of the injured party knew what really happened. She advises Weiss to look at people as her equals before anything else. Human, faunus, it doesn't really matter. If she wants to fix this mess between her and her team, she needs to humble herself just a bit. She could be as skilled and as well trained as she wanted to. No one wants to work with, let alone talk to, someone who was pompous and ungrateful. Pyrrha looks to the entranceway to the roof, knowingly, having been aware of RWBY's presence the entire time. She tells Weiss that maybe the first thing she needed to do in order to get on that path was to learn how to apologize. She nods to RWBY, who has decided to walk out onto the roof. Pyrrha smiles and leaves the two alone, saying that Ren was planning to make Nora some pancakes and she wasn't going to miss out. RWBY and Weiss are left standing awkwardly on the roof. Thank you for watching Section 4 of Fixing RWBY Part 3. I'd love to give a big shout out to all of my wonderful patrons who have each helped this channel grow into what it is today. If you want to support the channel, please consider donating at patreon.com/CelticPhoenix. Remember, by donating $1 or more, you can get access to the Team Frostbite Discord server, where personalities like myself, FamtanFalling, and Tom Horan of Six Lick Productions regularly interact with our supporters. Please stick around for the next installment, and I'll catch you all on the flip side.